All right, well, our guests tonight, you know them, you love them. They were here before to talk about haunted baseball, and we've had them on to talk about Dan's first book, Cape Encounters. Mickey Bradley and Dan Gordon co-authored the popular haunted baseball book. Bradley, a lifelong Yankee fan, has been a freelance writer for many years. He lives in Albany, New York. And Gordon, who lives and dies with the Red Sox, is the author of Cape Encounters, contemporary Cape Cod ghost stories. His writings on baseball have appeared in numerous publications. He lives in Providence, Rhode Island. So we welcome Dan and Mickey to the show. Guys, I can't start it off with the usual Red Sox-Yankees rivalry AL East talk here because that ship has pretty much sailed.
Or sunk.
This is Mickey speaking. After the last couple of days, I'm happy to not talk about that anyway.
Yeah, come on, though. In a few weeks, you'll still be able to talk about it, and we won't. So
yes, I've got that.
Which, as we always say here on Spooky South Coast, we're full supporters of the Red Sox, but if they don't make the postseason and we get to come on every Saturday night in October and do a full show, well, that's okay, too.
Tim, you've always been a great athletic supporter.
I am. I couldn't be an athlete, so I chose to be an athletic supporter.
So, than being a jock.
So, guys, when we talked to you about haunted baseball, you told us then that there were so many stories that you couldn't get them all into one volume and that eventually a second volume would have to happen. And that was just with what you gathered in putting that book together. I can only imagine that with the success of haunted baseball, you had more ball players that were willing to open up and share some of their experiences.
Yeah. You're both going to jump in. This is Dan. Yeah, it was amazing. These stories keep, there are more stories every year. I know you had us on a couple of years ago with the buried jersey incident at Yankee Stadium where the construction worker buried, Red Sox fan buried a Ortiz jersey. And, Mickey did a lot of great research on that and found out that there are actually a lot more things buried there. And, but just in general, players, there are always things going on every year. And so,
but I know, too, part of the problem then was that a lot of the players, didn't want to share things. They would kind of give you a weird eye when you were asking questions about the ghosts. But, Mickey, you have to deal with the team that's probably, the most synonymous with ghosts with the Yankees. So, have you found that they're actually opening up more and they're more willing to talk to you? They see you and they're like, hey, there's the ghost guy. I got a story for you.
Yeah, I did come to be known as the ghost guy with a couple of players. I was surprised, to see that some remembered me that way. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. It is an unusual question that we ask people, and you get all kinds of reactions to it. And there's always a danger that when you tell these kinds of stories to someone like me or Dan that you don't know, it could come out in a different way, and they could easily get teased by it, about it by the fans or by their teammates. But for the most part, I was impressed at how many people were willing to open up and share those stories. And you're right, with the second book, I think it got even more forthcoming. I can remember being in one locker room where I started asking some questions, and people started talking about a haunted hotel that they stay in a lot. And someone said, oh, yeah, there was something on the web that someone printed out that was going around the locker room. Everyone was reading it and passing it around to each other. And it turned out to be a chapter from our first book on the Vinoy Hotel. Well, so once we had that sort of notoriety behind us, it probably did open up a few doors and open up a few stories.
As somebody who deals with professional athletes for a living, I can tell you that they always tell you they don't read the press, they don't read what's written about them, they don't read the clippings, but that's BS. The teams put together packets and give them to them so they know what's going on, and I'm sure that that story went around more than anything. The people that I feel sorry for, though, are the people that have had to experience this that aren't baseball players, people who have stayed in these rooms and haven't had the opportunity to tell the story, because when they tell the story, people look at them like they're crazy. But when a baseball player tells the story, it's, oh, well, he's a baseball player, so it's got to be true.
Well,
yeah.
Sorry,
go ahead,
Dan.
Oh, no, but they get razzed a lot. And we have a whole chapter just on pranks and kind of players going at each other, just kind of, they're all, mostly it's players that do believe, but they also, there's a lot of, hazing going on in the game concerning the ghosts, so, yeah.
When you were putting together this sequel book, and you kind of want to touch upon a lot of the same organizations that you may have in the first book. And Mickey, did you find that with especially with the Yankees, that there was fresh stories to tell aside from the new stadium and everything? But were there other stories that hadn't yet been uncovered? Because we've been talking about the ghost of Yankee Stadium for 50-plus years now.
Right. Well, so we had that in the first book, and I was wondering, one of the things we talked about with players in the first book is, will the ghost make the transition to the new stadium? Because at that point, the stadium was happening, but it hadn't been constructed yet. And, Derek Jeter said that he thought that they would, and Alex Rodriguez, who was a big believer in the ghost of Yankee Stadium, too, he was sort of hopeful as well. So we did get some new stories about that. Of course, the jersey that Dan was mentioning being buried in the Yankee Stadium, that had some great opportunities for us, too. And, yeah, there were other things happening because, these stories are happening all the time, like Dan mentioned before. So one of the new stories in the book just happened last year. It has to do with Brett Gardner, who had visited a children's hospital one day. He was not supposed to play in the game that night. It was a Friday. And he spent his afternoon reading books to sick children. There was one child in particular, an 18-year-old girl who was very ill. She'd had a lot of problems throughout her childhood, but at that point she'd been in the hospital for 3 months waiting for a heart transplant, which she desperately needed. She was getting weaker all the time. She gave Gardner, who's a big Yankee fan, a bracelet. Project Hope was the name of the group that had him come in to read. Yellow bracelet, and told him that every time he wore it, he would hit a home run. That's unlikely for most players to hit a home run every single time. Gardner, at that point, had hit exactly one home run in his entire career. But sure enough, that night he did end up getting in the game. Johnny Damon got thrown out for arguing with an umpire. Gardner came into the game, and his first time up, he hit a ball that landed in the outfield and started rolling, and he kept running. And he ended up with the first inside the park home run of the new stadium, the first time a Yankee had hit one in 10 years. And afterwards, he talked about that bracelet. But what was most amazing about that story was, at around the same time, while that game was happening, perhaps while he was rounding the bases, the girl's family got the phone call they'd been waiting for 3 months, that her heart had suddenly become available, and the next morning she was in surgery getting her heart. So those kinds of stories are happening. I can't say they're happening all the time, but that certainly happened since we did the first book. So with the Yankees and with lots of teams, there were opportunities to find stuff that we hadn't mined the first time, because these things are just always popping up.
Well, now we can officially call the new Yankee Stadium, I guess, almost a burial ground of sorts, because there actually are human remains now at the stadium.
Right. Well, in the first book, we talked about how often fans try to sprinkle the ashes of loved ones on fields that the departed really enjoyed. So a lot of teams have that happen. Sometimes the teams will condone it. If you ask nicely, the Cubs will let you come into Wrigley Field and even do a little ceremony to sprinkle some ashes onto the field. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, in other places, fans just try to take the tour, or in the middle of a game, lean over and sprinkle some ashes. But yes, in the new Yankee Stadium, all kinds of people buried all kinds of stuff there to curse the Yankees, sometimes to give the Yankees good luck. And we know of at least one person who buried part of his father's ashes in Section 205 to try to bring good luck to the team and to give his father a permanent place with the team that he loved.
And Dan, when did you go into Fenway Park and bury the ashes of the 2010 season?
I think the Sox took care of that themselves.
Well, I did realize, though, when I was reading the chapter on Babe Ruth, and we all know about the story about Babe Ruth's ghost and obviously being seen at Yankee Stadium and other places along the way. And I'd heard the story about the piano, but I didn't realize how connected the spirit of Babe Ruth was with so many places up in our neck of the woods, obviously going back to when he played for the Red Sox, but even beyond when he would return to this area.
Yeah, especially in Sudbury and the surrounding towns. I mean, Babe, basically, he settled there. I mean, that's where he spent his winter months, and starting when he was with the Sox, and then even when he was with the Yankees, his second wife, kind of encouraged him to get out of New York City because he was kind of getting himself into a lot of trouble. And but he had, he loved it here. He had a farm in Sudbury. He had a cottage as well, and they used to go fishing, and that the piano story is very famous. But I mean, he frequented a lot of bars and places, and local people, a few of the old timers still know it, or their sons and daughters talk about it still. So it's kind of stories passed down. But and of course, we we came upon a really interesting ghost story, because Babe also, of course, frequented, as was legendary, bordellos as well, and there was a house in Marlborough that turned out, it found out that it was actually a former bordello, and that Babe used to go there, and the current residents there, feel that he came to visit, actually, and so I mean, there are a lot of fun stories connected with him, and we got stories up and down the East Coast, and Baltimore, of course, in school where he, which he was very attached to, throughout his life, and kind of where he was raised. It was kind of an orphanage school that where he was sent, and even down in Florida, St. Pete, which was kind of his other, very famous stomping grounds, and lots of stories about the Babe down there too.
One thing that I really learned from the book that I didn't realize is just how many bordellos there were in the Sudbury and Marlborough areas back during the Prohibition era. I mean, I'm not surprised to find that out, but still, that's the kind of thing that a lot of towns don't talk about until there's some sort of ghost story linked with them. I mean, we have it right in our town of Wareham. There's a story that's associated with a former bordello there, and everybody's ears perk up when you say that. But it seems like the Babe really got around up in this neck of the woods.
Yeah, definitely. It was great, researching this chapter, and you could have kept going forever on it, and definitely, spoke with a lot of the local historians, and it was interesting, especially during the Prohibition era, and that's when, Babe was the peak of his career, so he kind of, inhabited not only a lot of bordellos, but a lot of, these moonlighted a lot of bars. There's one right near Fenway, actually, and it's kind of it was actually at there's a dormitory now called Miles Standish Hall, and he actually had a room there. But in the basement of that place and many other places, they had kind of, they would drink, secretively, and it was kind of, just part of the culture, the way that, they got around the laws back then.
Well, one very interesting figure in the book, and we all have heard about Linda Ruth Fassetti, and we've seen her on Red Sox broadcasts when she's sitting out in the stadium, and a lot has been made of her as being the Babe's granddaughter, and what her presence means, whether it be for the Red Sox, against the Red Sox, whatever it is. I mean, she's become a cult figure in this area, and it's nice because in that chapter you get a chance to actually realize who she is and how she feels that she's made a connection with the spirit of her grandfather.
Yeah, it was fantastic working with her, and she was she was so open and honest, and just kind of talking about not only the Babe, the ghost stories which she had about her grandfather, and kind of the spiritual connection that she thinks she has, but in general just about her, his place in their family, and what it was like being Babe Ruth's granddaughter, and it was kind of really a fun chapter to write, and yeah, she had a lot of ghost stories. She calls them kind of like, she calls it the Babe Ruth roller coaster ride. Just kind of very strange things that happened at odd times that kind of help her out. She said anything from needing a cab at a certain moment to I talked about the 2004 playoffs and the division series where the Red Sox had to walk off against Anaheim. Ortiz did, and right before then, she kind of she invoked the Babe, saying that Babe, come get into Ortiz's bat, and end this game, and that's what happened. And then same thing happened during the games against the Yankees when they came back, and Ortiz had those walk-off hits. She claimed it on 3 separate occasions. Now she doesn't claim that she doesn't want to take responsibility for. She thinks it was Ortiz. She says, it was Ortiz and this and that. But she just thinks it was really odd that the timing of that and her invoking her grandfather at that moment, at those moments.
Well, it would have been nice if she could have invoked the Babe to get into Bill Buckner's glove. Maybe kept him out of Bucky Dent's bat.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, we know the stories of Fenway. We know you've talked with us about the ghost stories of Fenway. We read about them in Haunted Baseball. And everybody knows about the ghosts of Yankee Stadium. One stadium that I had never heard any stories associated with, and it was just a fascinating read, was Tiger Stadium, the old Tiger Stadium. actually being what sounds like it's pretty severely haunted.
Yeah, that was one of the advantages of doing a second book, because when we were doing the first, as you mentioned, we got lots of stories on lots of places, lots of teams covered, and it was always sort of a disappointment to me that we never got anything on Tiger Stadium. We had asked. We interviewed a bunch of Tigers, and we just never quite got that nugget that really could blossom into a chapter. But this time we did, and yeah, there's a lot of stories about the stadium. For people who don't remember, the stadium, a very old stadium. In fact, it went into use the exact same day that Fenway did in 1912. But it played its last game at the end of the 1999 season. And for almost 10 years after that, the city of Detroit was trying to decide what to do with the place. It was very historic and very beautiful and much loved, and people thought we must find some kind of way to repurpose it. No one really wanted to tear it down. But the city was always threatening to tear it down, and in the meantime, it was just sort of falling into disrepair. And the first things that we started to hear were from security guards who worked the night shift there. They had stories of strange orbs that they would encounter while doing their rounds. People had bizarre things happen to them while in the security office late at night. My favorite story there was a guy who said that he was watching TV and he suddenly looked down at his arm and saw scratches being etched into the skin of his arm with no explanation for why that was happening or what was causing it. So those kinds of things were happening. And then you started hearing other stories about people driving by the park and hearing the sound of a game going on late at night. People said they could sometimes see Ty Cobb and other players of that era sort of rounding the bases. We started hearing all kinds of stories like that, which really gave a great historic life to the old ballpark. Now, the park has since been torn down, and the new park that the team used, Comerica Park, which has been in existence since the 2000 season, has started to accrue some ghost stories of its own. Those are mentioned in the book as well. But some of them are said to be Ty Cobb, and some of them are said to be the result of some accidents and some folks who died at the site during the construction of the building and then afterwards too.
Well, I think now too we're going to hear stories about Ernie Harwell. His voice being heard announcing in the stadium as well.
Yeah, and Ernie Harwell is one of the people that I had the chance to talk to for that chapter. Just a great opportunity to really tap into Tiger's history when you think about someone like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's exactly the kind of person that you expect to start hearing stories about, because so many of these stories really are ways in which great players and other people associated with the team are honored and remembered after they've died. So some people believe very literally, of course, in these ghost stories. Other people that I talk to all the time who like the books will say, I'm not sure that I believe literally in the ghosts, but I love these kinds of stories as a way to keep the history and tradition of the game present.
Absolutely, and the books give you a great inside look at how Major League Baseball works and what these players are like, what the managers are like, the front office people. So you really get an idea of who the people are that make the sport possible. One thing that I think is interesting, and we've talked here on the show numerous times about exactly what the nature of a ghost is. If it's not necessarily the soul of a person who has passed away, but sometimes it can be created by the memories, the desires, the wants of the people who are living. And I think that when you have these iconic figures that are in these parks, then when people go there and they keep remembering them and they keep, giving out positive signs toward their energies, then it's possible to almost recreate them in these parks. And I think that might be part of what's happening.
That's certainly one of the things that we hear a lot. I mean, in talking to some of the ghost hunter folks that I've interviewed in the course of doing these books, they talk about that kind of thing. We were just talking about Tiger Stadium, and I had a chance to walk through there with a ghost hunter, and he said it made perfect sense that a place like that would be haunted or have spirits, because the energy of people is what accumulates in a place, and the place that they had a lot of strong emotional attachments to, or any kind of emotional response, is the place that their spirit is apt to reside in afterwards. During the first book, we had several chapters actually that had to do with the Cubs, but one talked about Wrigley Field in particular. He was just talking about Ernie Harwell, but after Harry Carey died, their beloved announcer, they actually brought in some ghost hunters because the team was doing very well, and the rumor had started that he was somehow in the park helping the team out. And the investigators went first to his announcing booth. They said they didn't find anything there. They started going around the park, and they were on the pitcher's mound, didn't quite see anything there. When they got to the bleachers, which is a well-known place of a lot of excitement in Wrigley Field, they started registering all kinds of energy spikes, they said. And again, the same reasons that you were just saying, it seemed to make sense to them because that's where people have a lot of focus, a lot of energy, and that stays beyond their physical presence.
So there's no truth to the rumors then that the Harry Carey ghost sightings were really just Will Ferrell running around saying, "I love hot dogs."
That will be, you have to read, our third book for that. That'll all be revealed there.
Well, speaking of Wrigley Stadium, I mean, obviously they have the Billy Goat curse happening there, and doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon. Has they made any new attempts to try and get rid of that curse?
People are always trying to get rid of that curse. Fans are doing things. The team sometimes does things as well. Probably one of the most notorious efforts that they've had in the last few years was a priest that was brought in. When they made the postseason in 2008, the team officially brought in a priest in a very quiet way. They didn't want any kind of media attached to this, who rumor had it that he was brought in to conduct an exorcism on the field. He insists that that's not the case. He was brought in merely to bless the field, but as part of his blessing, they say some kind of incantation about any negative spirits or energies leaving the place behind. He started blessing the dugout in the afternoon before the game started, and some press was there and caught it and started, really running with the story a little bit. The team got a little skittish about it and asked him not to bless the rest of the field. So there's videotape that was shown on ESPN of a priest in robes walking around with holy water and sprinkling it in the dugout, and Crane Kennedy, the president of the Cubs, was with him and helping out in that, but they really disavowed it pretty quick afterwards.
Well, they've tried this before. I remember they tried to do it at Fenway Park, but it didn't work because the priest that they got to conduct the exorcism was not a real priest. It was Father Guido Sarducci. So, if had he been ordained by the Catholic Church, there might have been a chance. I got the perfect way to solve this whole curse of the Billy Goat. It would just involve losing about a half a stadium's profits for one day. Have everybody that goes to the game bring a goat with them.
Well, they've certainly tried bringing goats into the field before. They've, in fact, the man who put the original curse on the team, Billy Goat Cyanus, his nickname was Billy Goat. His nephew still sort of continues that tradition today. He runs the tavern, a series of taverns there are now, and he has brought a goat to the game on several occasions. He claims that he was turned away the night of the Steve Bartman game, that he was there with a goat and they didn't let him in, and that's why the whole Bartman incident happened. But he's been there invited and allowed to come in on several occasions. Usually before postseason games, they'll bring a goat in and parade him around the field, but it hasn't quite had the desired effect yet. Now, in the last couple of years also, some fans who maybe have a little bit too much energy for this have left a goat's head and I think some kind of disembodied goat bowels or something on the statue of Harry Carey just outside the park prior to the start of the season. Obviously, that's nothing that the team wants anything to do with. No one wants
creepy. To do with. Well, hey, Billy Goats in the stadium, not really so good for the curse, but great fertilizer for the infield.
There you go.
All right, well, why don't we take a break? When we come back, I want to talk to you a little about the Angels Stadium in Anaheim, because this is a spirit that we deal with a lot here on the south coast of Massachusetts. That's Native American spirit. So we'll take a break. When we come back, more about Haunted Baseball sequel, Field of Screams, with Dan Gordon and Mickey Bradley when we come back here on Spooky South Coast. All right, well, we are talking with Mickey Bradley and Dan Gordon, the authors of Field of Screams, Haunted Tales from the Baseball Diamond, the Locker Room, and beyond. And guys, I had mentioned before the break Angel Stadium in Anaheim, and some of the ghost stories that are coming out of this are downright creepy. It sounds like there's a real Native American presence there.
Yeah, we had in our first book we covered injury curse in the stadium. That players have long thought that they believe that the ballpark was built over a Native American burial ground, and they believe that was causing some both injuries, fatalities. And the Angels have had a long, tragic history. Players are being shot, car accidents, and just a higher amount of fatalities than other teams. And but also just but after they won in 2002, that kind of went away. But there've been ghost stories too, and we talked to some stadium workers that had stories. First came out Troy Percival actually kind of led us to that. He tipped us on these stories, and then we went in and started talking to. We talked to a clubby longtime clubby who talked about a boombox sliding off of a shelf before his eyes, and also one playing, blasting music coming on by itself. But some of the oddest stories actually came from a former bat boy, a longtime bat boy. He reported like hearing, odd noises, a sensation of being watched, apparitions of players, apparitions of workers, apparitions of a former coach, Jimmy Reese, who was a beloved coach who was with the Angels in different capacities for over 6 decades. Even some of the weirdest stories he had were, apparitions coming down the hallway and following him and faces on the wall. And he described them kind of as Native American faces, and he kind of thought because of Native Americans, the way they're buried, and we talk about this too in our chapter on Cooperstown, which I can touch on later. But basically, they're buried in a crouching position, and he kind of could almost pick that up as he was walking through the corridors. So some really bizarre tales from that ballpark.
Well, and of course they do have a few guardian angels there as well. I mean, of course, Gene Autry, who is no owner loved a team probably more than he loved the Angels, and now Nick Adenhart. A lot of the players I know, they feel he's watching over them as well.
Yeah, that was really nice. We wrote about that as well, and got some nice comments from players. That they kind of thought, in many ways that Adenhart was watching over them after he had died in a car accident in April, tragically hit by a drunk driver after his first start, and kind of very promising young pitcher. And guys just they carried his jersey to different, on the road, and a lot of that happens a lot with, when a teammate dies, but they kind of actually put him in the dugout and they touched his jersey all the time, and there was a mural on the outfield wall, and players always touched it before the game and kind of acknowledged him. And they doused his jersey with champagne when they clinched the pennant, and it was kind of an eerie incident when Anaheim defeated the Sox last year, knocked them out of the playoffs. It was at Fenway, and a gate opened up by itself, and when LA Times writer kind of noted the eeriness of that. So it was but it was a very nice story. It's kind of a nice way to write about the inner workings of the game and kind of how players honor past players, and kind of that bond, special bond that goes on in baseball.
All right, well, we are coming up on the end of this hour. We're going to take a break for the news, and then when we come back on the second hour, we'll talk more about Field of Screams, Haunted Tales from the Baseball Diamond, the Locker Room, and Beyond. If you want to get the book, you can go to fieldofscreamsonline.com. It's also available through Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com. Anywhere where you buy books online, you can find this book. And while you're at it, pick up Haunted Baseball as well, so you can get all the stories from the first go-around as well. We're going to take a brief break for the news. When we come back, we'll talk more about Paranight 2010. And by request, I'll give some more information about Ghosts of the South Coast. But tonight it's all about Dan and Mickey and Field of Scream. So we'll be right back with more coming up after the news. And who knows, maybe we'll even have some interesting baseball-related music to play, against my better judgment. We'll be back with more here on Spooky South Coast. And now let's get back to the guys who are actually good at this. The guys who have written not one but 2 books on the idea of baseball and its ghosts, and the new one is called Field of Screams, Haunted Tales from Baseball Diamond, the Locker Room, and Beyond. Guys, I know that I don't have to blame you for this. I know that I have to blame the publisher, but you guys know that it is, they don't call it the Locker Room in baseball.
Well, they do. They call it the clubhouse, yeah, but, it's thrown around, yeah. It's just not as common, yeah. It's kind of... Yeah.
Yeah, but it sounds better to the casual, non-hardcore baseball fan. When you say locker room, that's how they know they're really getting inside. You say clubhouse, they're like, yeah, I don't really know what you're talking about.
Well, the book is being marketed toward regular people who are not necessarily, professional baseball players. So.
But people who are big-time baseball fans and really diehard baseball fans are going to love all the stories that come out of this book. And I know that, out of all the sports, I'd say baseball is probably like third on the list of what I follow. I write about football, I write about basketball. Those are my passions. But I do enjoy the history of baseball more than I do the modern game. The modern game has been kind of ruined the last few years with all the steroid scandals and all the other stuff that's been going on. So what's good about this book is it takes you back to some of the simpler times and some of the, I almost want to say, the better heroes of the bygone era. And, of course, one of those being Roberto Clemente, who is a hero not only as a baseball player but as a human being. Because not a lot of people realize, but when he lost his life, he was actually on a relief mission to help people back in his native Puerto Rico, right?
Yeah, actually, he was actually helping on his way to Nicaragua from Puerto Rico. Yeah, there was a huge massive earthquake in 1972, and so many people died, and it was to this day there are still ruins standing from that. That haven't been buildings that are still remnants. And yeah, he was on his way with that. He'd found out that Somoza, the dictator in Nicaragua, wasn't letting was basically taking all the relief goods that he was sending and wasn't getting to the people, and so he wanted to go there himself and make sure that it got distributed. And the plane had some problems with the engine. It was and it just basically crashed. And yeah, there have been ghost stories connected with that crash, and we have other ghost stories too in the book on Clemente.
And it seems like many of the Puerto Rican players that are in Major League Baseball today, they feel a special connection with the spirit of Roberto Clemente.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, and guys, like Carlos Delgado, future Hall of Famers, Carlos Beltran, different guys, they were. And we even, I during the research, I was in the World Baseball Classic interviewing players, and I remember attending a Puerto Rico game, and so many people had signs up saying, Clemente lives. I mean, and this is he died in '72, and so it's 38 years later, and people still remember, and kids still argue over who's going to get his uniform number 21, in Little League and things like that. So it's still an honor to wear that number, and to he's still very well remembered, and people are very proud of him. And yeah,
well, baseball has really honored his good service. There's a Roberto Clemente Award that is given to players who show exemplary community service. So, yeah, players like that his fame sort of extends beyond the game in a certain way, because he's just known as someone who was really about more than just what happened on the field.
Well, also, too, it seems like many of the Pirates players of today, they feel his presence around them all the time. And some of them welcome it, and some of them are a little freaked out by it. But it seems like he's watching over his team.
Yeah, that was it was a really fun chapter that we wrote on Pirate City, which has been a long-time home of the spring training home for the Pirates and of their Florida teams. It's in Bradenton, Florida, and basically, they had a dormitory there for the longest time. And when it was first built, the dormitory, when the complex was first built, Clemente wanted to stay there, even though he was a veteran and he could have stayed in a hotel. So he was basically there helping out younger players on the team and younger guys, because that was kind of his, who he was. And he always stayed in a dormitory overlooking the batting cages. I believe it was room number 232. And after he died, that room became first no one would stay in it, but then people started staying in it, and there were. Some players were kind of spooked staying there. Some players saw ghosts while staying there, and apparitions, different things. Not always, mostly actually not necessarily seeing Clemente, but seeing other apparitions, but kind of connecting with Clemente. And, other weird things. Latin players would often like to photograph the room. Some players requested the room, some refused to stay there. Ramos Ramirez, huge slugger with the Cubs, he enjoyed staying in that room, but other guys were kind of, really. Bronson Arroyo told us that when he was there, there was a painting that was painted while Clemente was alive of him, and it was on the wall, and he thought the eyes of the painting would follow him while he was, walking around the room. So he was kind of pretty spooked. So yeah, it really depends on the player, but those stories are very famous in baseball, and guys. That room was legendary.
Well, one of the players that you interviewed about some of the spirits at Pirate City was Barry Bonds. And what was the experience like trying to get Barry Bonds to talk on the record for this?
He was an interesting person to talk to, that's for sure. For the most part, he was happy to talk about what it was like to be at Pirate City. You know, that gets back to his days when he was first coming up himself. And he had a lot to say just about that complex. It's sort of set far in. It's from the road. It's behind some orange groves. It's back in the days when he was there, it was relatively primitive compared to the place that players stay in today. There was no television, or I think it was just a television in one main room. There were 4 guys to a room, and nothing like that today at most of these spring training complexes. So he had some stories, some fun stories just about, what it was like to be there. He used to sneak out. He said, there was an 11 o'clock curfew, and he would sort of sneak out to try to sample whatever nightlife he could find and then sneak back in at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning. He said he never got caught doing that. But he also, of course, had good things to say about, that history of Clemente and what he meant to the team, all that kind of stuff. So, one of the great pleasures of researching a book like this is that Dan and I got to talk to so many colorful figures in the game, including major superstars like Barry Bonds and a lot of old-timers, Al Kaline and Willie Mays and folks like that. So hearing their stories, whatever they were talking about, was always a pleasure.
And you got a lot of inside stories that I think if a reporter walked up and started asking some of these questions, the player would dismiss them and wouldn't want to talk about it. But it seems like you guys really get in on the inside story of things, maybe because you're not sports writers and because you're the quote-unquote ghost guys. They know that they can tell you some things that, they might not share with the beat writers. And, of course, one of that is, and I got to ask you this, Mickey, knowing that you're a Yankee fan, did you ever wear the Good Luck thong?
No,
on your head? Not even on your head?
I did not wear it, but I did see it firsthand. You're talking about Jason Giambi's, It's sort of a gold lame,
yeah.
More leopard print thong that somehow became a good luck charm for him and for his teammates. He started wearing it actually when he was with the A's, but he brought it over to New York when he was with the Yankees. And, yeah, the story goes that when a player is in a slump, putting on that thong is a magic cure. You have to be really, really in a slump. It can't just be, you've had an 0 for 12 or something like that. But he insists that no one who has worn it has ever not gotten a hit the day that they wore it. And, when I asked him about it, it wasn't in the clubhouse. I was almost going to say locker room. It was in the clubhouse. And to tell you the truth, I didn't initially ask him specifically about it. I asked him if he had any kind of good luck charms that he believed in or wore or anything like that. And he initially told me about a necklace that he wears that was made for him by the daughter of the conditioning coach, I think, for the Oakland A's. And he's worn it every single game he's ever played as a professional. He's had it restrung several times, and it's a wonderful story about this child making it for him. But he didn't mention anything about the thong, and eventually I did ask him specifically about it, and he said, "Oh yeah, it's right here." And he pulled it out of his locker. It had his number on it, 25, and he talked about how magical it is.
Considering Johnny Damon's penchant for walking around the clubhouse buck naked, I'd almost want him to be in a slump so that at least he would wear the thong and be somewhat covered up.
Damon has worn it at least twice and gotten hits when he was in serious slumps. Yeah,
he claimed that wearing it, he would forget about what's going on in the game and just be thinking about the thong and how uncomfortable it is. And that's
just hope that the elastic waistband and the belt hold up so that the fans don't see it. Now, one of the other things I wanted to ask about the Yankees, they recently lost George Steinbrenner, and I was wondering if you'd heard any stories about his spirit already being associated somehow with the team.
I have not heard any of that yet, but I certainly wouldn't be surprised if you start to hear it soon. He died in July. He died, I think, just a couple days after Bob Shepard died, who was a longtime announcer for the club. And it would be, very typical of the kinds of stories that we hear that in the next few months, especially if they make it into the postseason, and especially if they start to have some sort of remarkable comebacks, those are the kinds of things that get people talking about what could be responsible for these highly unusual, on-field heroics. Steinbrenner just had a monument unveiled last week to him in Monument Park. That's something that's only done for posthumous players or people strongly associated with the team. So it's only the sixth monument that the Yankees have done. And that, too, is the kind of thing that just sort of starts to solidify the notion of an ongoing presence or a spirit or an energy that's going to stay in that park.
Yeah, it was interesting to see David Wells, touching his, I don't know if you saw that, but touching his monument during that ceremony, kind of just like they always touch Babe Ruth's monument, and I believe Wells, had that tradition along with, I remember Clemens did too.
Yeah, Clemens did too, yeah.
Well, I think that when his spirit is experienced at Yankee Stadium, you'll probably have investigators going in there at some point, capturing EVPs of him yelling at Billy Martin.
You have to find some way for a spirit to be firing people. I don't know if that can happen.
Interestingly, there's Steinbrenner Stadium down in Tampa, where he had offices, and we have a story in Field of Screams about that being haunted. Those offices being haunted. So who knows if that's going to eventually be attributed to Steinbrenner.
Well, I guess you calm down a little bit in the afterlife, they say, that when you realize that there's more than just this mortal life, you're enlightened and you're a better spirit because of it. So let's hope that George goes through that kind of transition as well. All right, well, why don't we take a break here? When we come back, I want to talk about another new tradition, a new old tradition with the Red Sox, and it's the idea of these superstitions. Every team seems to have their different superstitions, and with the Red Sox, it's a song. So we'll talk about Tessie, and when we come back, we'll play the original version. But Matt, why don't you lead us out into commercial with the Dropkick Murphys version, and we'll discuss this a little bit later on. But there's a paranormal connection with the Dropkick Murphys version of Tessie. We'll get into all of that. I'm not even sure if the guys know. They probably do. They know everything about haunted baseball. So stay tuned. We'll be back in a minute. You can call in if you'd like, 1-877-996-1420 or 508-996-0500 if you're local. And you can also join in the chat room as well. Just go to SpookySouthCoast.com and click on the Fate Radio link, and you can join us there and watch the show as it streams. All right, so we'll be right back with more here on Spooky South Coast.
This is the only, sung by Mr. Queen, Columbia Records. Yes, he is a maiden with a sparkling eye. Yes, he is a maiden with a laugh. Yes, he doesn't know the meaning of the sky. Yes, he's lots of fun and full of chaff. But sometimes we have a little quarrel, we do. Yes, he always sends a head away. Then it's up to me to do as all boys do. So I take a hand in mine and say, Tessie, you make me feel so badly. Why don't you turn around? Tessie, you know I love you madly, babe. My heart weighs about a pound. Don't blame me if I ever doubt you. You know I wouldn't live without you, Tessie.
All right, welcome back to Spooky South Coast. Tim Weisberg here, along with the silent assassin Matt Costa, science advisor Matt Moniz, and we are talking about Field of Screams, Haunted Tales from the Baseball Diamond, the Locker Room, and Beyond, the new book by Mickey Bradley and Dan Gordon. You can get it at fieldofscreamsonline.com, as well as Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, and wherever else you buy books online. And also, of course, it's in all the bookstores. And, Dan, I know that in this area you probably have a lot of signings happening in the month of October. Anything that you can think of off the top of your head?
Yeah, tomorrow I'll be in Cumberland at Phantom Farms. That's from 12 to 3. October 28th at the Barnes & Noble in Warwick, Rhode Island. I'll be there. And we're still setting some other stuff up, too.
Well, keep Wednesday, October 20th open if you can.
Oh, okay, sure.
We'd love to have you at Paranight 2010 to sign copies of the books for people.
Oh, that would be cool. Yeah.
All right. And plus, I don't think we've never had the chance to meet face-to-face, you and I.
I know. We always, we don't, it's like, yeah, we're in the same building, but never at the same time.
So we'll definitely make sure that we alleviate that situation because we'll both be out and about signing books, and doing different things.
Yeah,
so.
Congratulations on your book. By the way.
Thank you. Well, wait till you read it before you congratulate me. All right, but we did play. We played the song Tessie, both versions of it, and it's interesting because there's a lot of facts that you point out about the song in the book. And Dan, I'll ask you this: being the Red Sox fan, it seemed like for a long time it was a good luck charm for the team, and then it just fell by the wayside.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was like it kind of it evolved back in the era when like fans were really they weren't driven by like announcers and scoreboards and telling them what to program and then what to sing and everything, but it was kind of more they used to sing, fans used to invent songs, and there was a group of fans called the Royal Rooters, and they basically came up with a song during the 1903, the very first World Series, the 03 World Series, and they sang it both at home and on the road, and it really started driving the Pirates crazy. And Honus Wagner, legendary Pirate, Hall of Famer, claimed that years later that kind of affected the outcome, and many other and the Red Sox kind of it took that series. They won over the span that they used. They sang that from 1903 to 1918. The Sox won 5 World Series. They were 25-7, had a 25-7 win-loss record in the World Series games. And then it kind of when the Royal Rooters faded out, so did the song, and just disappeared. And over the years, a few fans kind of like speculated, well, maybe if they brought the song back, the Sox might start winning, but nobody really did. One year they played it on a record player, and it didn't really do much. And then in 2004, 2003, actually, the off season, Dr. Charles Steinberg started talking with Boston Herald reporter Jeff Horrigan, and they started wondering maybe there's something, maybe they could recreate this song. And Horrigan wrote the lyrics, and the Dropkick Murphys were interested in doing it. And yeah, it was great. We interviewed all the players involved, including the Dropkick Murphys, and it was really, and basically, anyways, to make the long story short, they played it in the 2004, and the very first time they played it was in the game that where A-Rod was plunked, and then he went after. Then Veritek, hit him A-Rod in the face in that very famous game, and the kind of many people thought that was kind of the momentum turner of that season. And basically, every time they played it since, they've played it in 5 games. That's it, live in the ballpark. The Sox are 5-0, and always win in dramatic fashion. And they've only played it in 2 years, in 2004 and 2007, the 2 years that they won the World Series. And so, definitely, there are believers, especially in the Sox front office. There were a lot of people who were convinced that the song had something to do with it. But even some of the players were convinced, and was saying to the Dropkick to Murphys when they say, hey, you're our good luck charms. And Ken Casey, the lead singer, vocalist, and bass player for the Dropkicks, definitely believed that. He was one of the first people to predict that and he said it even in his liner notes that this song would bring the Sox to the series. So I don't know why they don't play it every year live. But,
I was going to ask that. Why don't they just keep playing it live if that's the case? But
yeah.
I guess
it's probably for the same reason they can't wear the thong every day.
Yeah, that's true.
Too much of a good thing.
Exactly. If you'll lose the magic if you keep trying to squeeze it all out of it. Well, it was interesting too that they couldn't use the original lyrics, obviously, because they don't make much sense for baseball. And even the Royal Rooters didn't use the original lyrics; they made up their own. So Jeff Horrigan had to write new lyrics for the new recording, right?
Yeah, exactly. And basically, he wrote lyrics that were about the original Royal Rooters and them singing the song. So it's kind of like the song within the song, and and he did a great job. And obviously, it's a popular song to this day, and beyond baseball fans. So.
Absolutely. And of course, Dan, I know you know the connection, the paranormal connection with that song and the paranormal in this region. Jeff Horrigan's brother being John Horrigan, who's a big supporter of the paranormal here in Massachusetts and puts together the Mass Monster Mash every year.
Yeah, it's really cool. Yeah.
Just one of those things, it just shows that all this stuff's connected somehow. So, Mickey, I guess, if you wanted to, we could get somebody to write a song for the Yankees. I mean, they seem to be doing all right without one.
Well, they play New York, New York at the end of every victory in the stadium.
Yeah, but that wasn't written for them.
It wasn't written for them, no. So Pepsi wasn't, well, I guess the redone version was written for them, yeah.
I like the Liza Minnelli version.
That's just because you're tired of having to hear the Sinatra version all the time when the Yankees win.
Exactly, yeah.
I knew we'd work some smack talk in there somewhere.
I don't know. All I heard there is that the Yankees win all the time. That's my takeaway from that sentence.
Well, one of the things that's really interesting about Field of Screams, and I'm assuming that this had to do with when you said you were able to actually go to the World Baseball Classic and talk to some of these players, but so many of the international baseball stories, ghosts associated with the game are not just an American phenomenon.
Yeah, it was really cool. And it's kind of, one of the fun things about writing this book is just you can, writing in general, as you know, Tim, is just, you're always learning something new. And, it was great to, I've been writing on international baseball for many years, but I didn't really know much about the superstitions and started, poking around. We started, my wife's Japanese, so she kind of served as a translator, but I basically, over in Japan, interviewed, dozens of Japanese players, got credentialed just like we did here in the States. And, of course, Mickey and I were also interviewing, Japanese players here in the States, too, about, their ghost stories and superstitions. And it's just kind of really cool to, to kind of record these stories that, their superstitions and their ghost stories, which, of course, they have similar ghost stories, but they have a very different way of dealing with it. And some of the stories are downright bizarre. And, and a lot of them are from, places like Hiroshima and Okinawa, just like here in the States, they would be from Gettysburg. But, also just some baseball sites and ballparks and hotels and dormitories. So,
yeah, they definitely do. The Japanese culture do treat their ghosts differently. They're much more revered, and they're seen more of a spiritual connection with the past than being a scientific anomaly as they're viewed here in the United States.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of funny, but you don't really see TV shows on the paranormal in Japan just because it's to them it's so what we see that we know we deal with it every day. They have the Oban holidays in August where they take home the spirits and lanterns of their ancestors, and kind of just a strong belief that that spirits are around, and even in baseball, and especially in baseball. There are so many rituals, and we recorded a lot of that for the book. Things like the simple things like you always see salt in baseball, and you do in other things too, like sumo wrestling and different things, and in Japanese society in general, sprinkled at doorways. And basically, the salt is both for purification and for keeping evil spirits away. And salt is often broken out in baseball during slumps, and you see grounds crew pouring it on the dugout steps, and players touch it as they go up and to take to warm up and to hit, and other rituals from the necklaces they wear to the wristbands to amulets they wear, and other things that are in their lockers too.
Mickey, did you notice as you were interviewing players and managers and people associated with the game, were there any cultural lines? Did any certain players from certain cultures seem to be more willing to talk or less willing to talk about these things?
I think I had that assumption a little bit going in, because you always hear that Latino players, for instance, are more superstitious than other players. Mm-hmm. But I can't say that I really found that to be true. Lots of players are superstitious. I might make the stereotype that baseball players are more superstitious than other athletes are. But, and I asked that question specifically of certain people. I remember talking with Bobby Valentine, who has, of course, had a career in the majors here and also managed in Japan. And I asked him specifically if he thought that Japanese players or Latino players were more superstitious than American players, and he said he didn't think so at all. There's a cultural aspect to the Japanese stories, like Dan was just talking about. But you really find these kinds of beliefs and these kinds of stories and all these sort of efforts to try to stay on the good side of whatever spirits are out there. You hear that from all different kinds of players. And when I think of the locker rooms that I've been in, I'm sure this is true for Dan too, you can go up and down. I mean, literally in our early days, we didn't know, we sort of cold calling people. We would just start walking down the row of lockers and ask people, do you have any stories about this kind of stuff? And you never knew who was going to have one, but every locker room had plenty of people who either had something happen to them firsthand, or they'd heard about a story from another guy that they knew, or they'd heard it even third or fourth hand. It was pretty rampant across all sort of demographic lines.
Is there any truth to the story that it's very bad to drink Joe Boo's wine?
I wouldn't recommend it.
I'm looking at my brother here in the studio. I don't think he got that one. It's very bad to drink Joe Boo's wine. From Major League. Mm-hmm. Pedro Serrano.
I think that's where a lot of those, some of those, I'll call them stereotypes, come from. If you know, I'm thinking of that movie and also in Bull Durham, where there's a lot of superstitious players, and again, they seem to be playing up the Latino angle even more there.
And just superstitions in general in this area, coming from watching Nomar go through those histrionics every time he got up to the plate for so many years. I mean, that's just shows you right there. I mean, even Ortiz. I mean, people talk about his, at-bat ritual, but I always thought that was kind of more to psych out the pitcher, because when you see somebody spit on their hands and rub them together, they're expecting to do some dirty work there. So.
Yeah, and some players prefer that word you just used. They'll say they have rituals rather than say that they have superstitions. Now, the ritual is such that if they don't do it every time, they get very panicked, and it can be things like, never stepping on the foul lines, have to drive the same way to the ballpark every time, have to eat the same food before a game, or step onto the field at exactly the same time. All those kinds of things that you hear about from various players that are fun stories for fans to follow.
Yeah, these things are ingrained. I mean, players say that their little league coaches teach them these things, so it's not just superstition. And Nomar himself, like Mickey said, he called them ritual. He said it wasn't superstitious, that it's kind of just everything that he did had a purpose, and was taught by his coaches and worked. But he definitely looking at every other player we talked to when we talked about superstition, many players would say, "Oh, go talk to Nomar." So it's all a matter of perspective.
One question I do want to ask that was in the chat room a little bit earlier is a listener wanted to know if there are any umpire ghosts that are ever seen. Are there any phantom calls being made by somebody from the beyond?
Maybe this year after the Galarraga game, and you got the no-hitter taken away from him, a perfect game rather. I don't know, Mickey. Have you heard any?
Yeah, I haven't heard anything like that. One of the interesting things we found is that the stories do come from everywhere. So we've been talking about some of the players that we talked to. They have a ton of stories, but we've also talked to some folks, front office folks, and certainly to a lot of fans. Anyone connected to the game has heard or experienced some of these kinds of stories. Umpires, I will say this, are a little hard to get to interview, because they're in their own section of the park, and they're very much, shielded from the press at all times. They have to keep their impartiality, all that kind of stuff. So I think that's probably why we haven't heard more stories from them, but I'm sure if we were to knock on those doors a little bit more, we would get a lot of stuff from those guys as well.
Well, if there's a Volume 3 in the works, you can definitely contact Joe West, because I think he runs his own website, joewest.com. He's the only umpire that thinks that he's bigger than the players, so I'm sure he'd be willing to give you a little bit of information. Now, one thing that I was, it comes up briefly in the chapter on Tessie, but I realize that this actually happens more than I thought about, is the idea of these little mascots that they had in the early days of baseball, the little Rastus and Eddie Bennett and Charlie Foster. It seems like there's been these people that are associated with organizations that are supposedly human good luck charms. But one that you didn't mention in the book, and I was a little surprised, Mahau Mahau didn't make it. Do you remember Mahau Mahau?
I refresh my memory.
Yeah.
The little guy that used to hang out with Pedro Martinez?
Oh, yeah. We actually, we tried to get something on that. Pedro didn't really open up on that.
He's sitting under the mango tree now.
Yeah. Yeah, Pedro is a really weird story. Yeah. I mean, he originally, Pedro, at some point he was saying it was good luck, and then he kind of retracted that and said, kind of went back and forth, and there was tension between him and Pedro. It's just kind of really weird stuff that went on. He actually passed away a couple years ago. Yeah.
When I read that part in the chapter, it made me think, Dr. Steinberg being the marketing genius that he is, I almost wondered if he put the bug in Pedro's ear to bring in this human good luck charm.
Yeah, there were so many weird things that went on during the 2004 season. I mean, Tessie in that story just being a few of them, just like things that were, and the whole, obviously the bullet, the sign on just at, I forget where it was, but it basically saying reverse the curse, and the reverse the curse ice cream and all this stuff, and there was just kind of a lot of, it was just a lot of talk and a lot of build up on that. So who knows what did what, and it just got, but it is fun, and it's great to kind of just see the passion that obviously I grew up with as a Red Sox fan, but and just basically recording, seeing it, kind of looking at it a little bit objectively, kind of like all the rituals that fans are doing.
That's one of the nice things about these curse stories. I mean, obviously, any fan of a team that's said to be cursed isn't too happy to have that hanging over their heads. But they do come to offer an opportunity for fans to really sort of, in the absence of a championship, have something to think about, to talk about, and to even become very actively involved in trying to undo. So whenever you see a team like the Cubs, the Red Sox, whomever, that has a curse story, you find fans who are really engaged in trying to do what they can to turn that around somehow.
Yeah, it's. I guess if you can't, you can only blame the players so much. You can only blame management so much, and eventually, it has to be something beyond that. So applying the curse idea to it, it gives you another scapegoat for the problems. Yeah,
I think it's a sort of human compulsion to look for cause and effect for things, and when you can't find a cause for the effect, a logical cause for the effect that you're seeing. The Cubs haven't won a World Series in over 100 years now. You start to look outside logic for reasons to help explain it.
So one last question here about these ghosts, and Ted Williams was revered in these parts and all throughout baseball, the last 400 hitter, and the way that he passed away. What happened after he passed away? There was all that drama, all that controversy with his son John Henry. Is there any spirit stories associated with him based on what ended up happening to his remains?
Not that we've heard of yet. We're still digging, so to speak. But yeah, obviously that that was it's sad for any Red Sox fan, like just having the memory of him kind of. And then, that being tarnished by all the talk about a severed head and, talk of his resurrecting him and all that stuff, just really weird, and a really weird family battle. But, yeah, no, we haven't actually heard Ghostoid yet. I mean, but, we did hear a lot. Actually, we do write a lot about him, and, obviously in Haunted Baseball and Field of Scream, just, because he is part of, there are so many great stories out there about him, and they kind of work their way into some of the chapters on Cooperstown and on the Red Sox and, and so forth. So it's kind of nice to work him in somehow. But, eventually the Splinter will probably work his way into one of our books, too.
Well, we ran out of time here, but we didn't really get to discuss Cooperstown, but there is a whole chapter on the ghosts there as well. I mean, it seems like they're definitely hanging out at the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, the Ghost of Cooperstown, yeah.
It's not surprising if anyone who's been to Hall of Fame knows when you walk through that great hall, it looks like a mausoleum. The plaques for all the players that are up there just sort of has that kind of a feel, and you feel like you're a little bit in the presence of all those great players. And so, not surprisingly, these folks who work at the hall report hearing odd things and strange things that go bump in the night. That's all in the chapter in the book.
Well, I can tell you this much. I'm sure there'll be more stories coming and more volumes of Haunted Baseball and Field of Screams coming forward. And we'll keep an eye out down here on the Cape League and pass along anything that we hear about. But, guys, thanks for joining us as always. And Dan, hopefully we can see you on the 20th.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Yeah.
All right.
It was fun being on again. Yeah,
and you're welcome back anytime. Dan Gordon and Mickey Bradley, they are the authors of Field of Screams, Haunted Tales from the Baseball Diamond, the Locker Room, and Beyond. Pick it up on their website, fieldofscreamsonline.com, and wherever you find books online. That does it for this week's show. We'll be back next week. We're not sure who the guest is yet. We're going to confer with content director Chris Balzano about that, but we'll have shows all throughout October. I think there's a chance that next week we could be starting late. They still haven't announced what time that Red Sox game is going to be. Whether or not it's, whether or not the importance of the game matters, or if it's whatever else is going on. I'm sure Fox wants Yankees Red Sox in the afternoon if they can get it, no matter what the situation is. So there's a good chance we'll be on at the regular time. But stay tuned to SpookySouthCoast.com. We'll have all the information and updates there. We'll also have the Ghost of the South Coast page up and running by the end of the week as well. And you can buy your tickets to Paranight 2010. Buy them right now. Why wait? There's very limited tickets available, especially for the VIP package, so you want to make sure that you get them now, get them early. And I'm just looking forward to a whole month of October shows. We've got some great stuff planned, some great Halloween-themed programs, some great programs that will send a little bit of a chill down your spine, so you want to stay tuned here each and every Saturday night. And, of course, if you've missed any of the programs, just go to the archives on SpookySouthCoast.com or sign up through iTunes or Zune Marketplace or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you still can't get them, then just call the studio. Matt Costa will burn you a CD, drive it to your house, and sit there and wait till you're done with it so you can take it back home with him. We won't send Moniz out there because he's in no state. All right. So thank you to Dan and Mickey for joining us, and thank you for Jeff Belandra for calling in and for whatever you did to Moniz. And until next week, for Matt Costa, for Matt Moniz, for Chris Balzano, I'm Tim Weisberg, and we want you all to stay spooktacular.